They walked in like they owned the law itself. Billionaire real estate mogul Madam Sterling strode into the Manhattan Supreme Court with a smirk that could cut glass, his Mistress Julianne hanging on his arm in a dress that screamed victory. They expected a broken woman. They expected a quick settlement. They expected Odetta Sterling to sign the papers and fade into oblivion. But they made a fatal miscalculation. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the sound of a trap snapping shut. Watch closely, because the single file Judge Thorne is about to lift doesn't just end a marriage, it destroys a dynasty. The morning air outside the New York County Supreme Court on Center Street was biting a gray, overcast Tuesday that promised rain. But for Madam Sterling, the weather was irrelevant. He didn't feel the cold. He moved through the world in a climate-controlled bubble of wealth and invincibility, insulated by a net worth of $4 billion and a reputation for crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. At 9:00 a.m., sharp, a convoy of 3 black Escalades pulled up to the curb, pushing through the swarm of paparazzi that had gathered since dawn. The flashes of the cameras went off like strobe lights, a chaotic disco in the morning gloom. The door of the middle vehicle opened, and Madame stepped out. He was 45, but looked 35, thanks to a strict regimen of private trainers and perhaps a touch of subtle surgical intervention. He wore a navy bespoke Brioni suit, cut so sharply it looked like armor. He buttoned his jacket with one hand and turned back to the car, with the other offering his hand to the woman inside. A collective gasp went through the press line. It was a breach of protocol so brazen it bordered on insanity. Usually in high-profile divorce cases, the mistress stays hidden. She stays in the penthouse, or better yet, on a yacht in the Mediterranean, until the ink is dry. But Julianne Vane didn't do hidden. She emerged from the dark interior of the SUV like a butterfly breaking free of a cocoon if the butterfly was wearing red Valentino and carrying a $20,000 Birkin bag. Julianne was 23, a former Instagram model whose rise to the side of New York's most powerful developer had been as rapid as it was controversial. She took Madame's hand, her fingers interlaced with his, and she smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't a shy smile. It was a beaming, radiant grin of pure triumph. She looked at the cameras, then up at Madame, and whispered something that made him throw his head back and laugh. "Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling. Is it true you're offering your wife 0 alimony?" a reporter from the Post shouted, thrusting a microphone over the barricade. "Is Julianne moving into the Park Avenue estate immediately?" asked another. Madame didn't answer. He simply guided Julianne up the massive stone steps, his body language screaming that this wasn't a trial. It was a coronation. He was trading in the old model for the new one, and he wanted the world to see the upgrade. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. The gallery was packed. Friends of the Sterlings, mostly fair-weather friends, who had already chosen the side with the money, filled the benches. They whispered behind their hands, eyes darting from Madame and Julianne to the empty table on the left. "She's late," Julianne whispered, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. She leaned into Madame, her shoulder brushing his. "Do you think she'll even show up?" Maybe she's finally realized it's over. Madame adjusted his silk tie. Odetta has always been dramatic in her own quiet way. She'll show up. She thinks she has a moral high ground. It's adorable, really. It's pathetic, Julianne corrected, smoothing her skirt. Arthur said she hired some strip mall lawyer from Queens. Can you believe that against Arthur Pendleton? Madam chuckled. Arthur Pendleton was the shark of sharks. He was a man who didn't just win cases. He eviscerated the opposition until they thanked him for stopping. Madam had paid Pendleton a $3 million retainer just to ensure Odetta walked away with nothing but her maiden name. At 9:15 a.m., the heavy oak doors at the back of the room creaked open. The whispering stopped. Odetta Sterling entered. She was 42, though the stress of the last year had etched fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She wasn't wearing red. She wasn't wearing designer flash. She wore a simple structured charcoal suit with a white blouse buttoned to the collar. Her hair, usually worn in loose waves, was pulled back into a severe, tight bun. She walked alone. No entourage, no security. Just a woman clutching a battered leather briefcase that looked like it had seen better decades. Behind her trailed a man who looked like he had slept in his car. His suit was ill-fitting, a shade of brown that had gone out of style in the 1990s. He was shuffling papers in his hands, dropping a pen as he walked through the gate, scrambling to pick it up. Julianne let out a loud, unladylike snort of laughter. "That's a him, that's the competition," Madame smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Samuel Cross. I looked him up. He mostly handles traffic tickets and slip-and-fall cases in the Bronx. This is going to be a slaughter, Julianne. A literal slaughter." Odetta didn't look at Madame. She didn't look at Julianne. She walked to the plaintiff's table, set her briefcase down with deliberate slowness, and sat. She stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, her face a mask of stone. "All rise!" the bailiff bellowed, his voice booming off the mahogany walls. The side door opened, and Judge Harrison Thorne walked in. If Madam Sterling was the king of New York real estate, Judge Thorne was the emperor of this courtroom. He was a man of 60, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that magnified eyes known for spotting a lie from a mile away. He was known as the Hammer for a reason. He didn't tolerate theatrics, he didn't tolerate delays, and he absolutely hated arrogance. He took his seat, arranging his robe, and peered over his glasses. His gaze swept over the packed gallery, pausing for a fraction of a second on Julianne's bright red dress. His lip twitched a micro-expression of distaste before his eyes moved to the defense table. "In the matter of Sterling versus Sterling." Judge Thorne's voice was gravel and authority. "We are here to determine the division of assets and the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Are both parties ready?" Arthur Pendleton. Madam's lawyer stood up. He looked like a silver fox, sleek and polished. "The defense is ready, Your Honor, and eager to conclude this unfortunate waste of the court's time." Samuel Cross. Odetta's lawyer stood up slowly. He pushed his glasses up his nose. "The plaintiff is ready, Your Honor." "Very well," Thorne said. "Mr. Pendleton, you may begin your opening statement." The shark smiled. He walked to the center of the floor, unbuttoning his jacket to signal he was getting down to business. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the gallery, playing to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pendleton began, his voice smooth as velvet. "We are here today because of greed. Plain and simple. My client, Madam Sterling, is a visionary. He built an empire from the ground up. He worked 18-hour days. He sacrificed. He bled for his company." He turned and pointed a manicured finger at Odetta. "And what did she do?" Pendleton's voice dropped to a mock whisper. "She shopped. She lunched. She enjoyed the fruits of a tree she did not plant. And now that the marriage has naturally run its course, as marriages sometimes do, she is not content with the generous settlement outlined in the prenuptial agreement she signed 20 years ago. No, she wants half. She wants to dismantle a business that employs thousands of people just to satisfy a personal vendetta. Madame nodded solemnity, looking the part of the victimized genius. Julian squeezed his hand under the table. "We will prove," Pendleton continued, pacing in front of Odetta, "that Odetta Sterling violated the infidelity clause of the pre-enup, effectively nullifying her claim to any assets. We will prove that while Mr. Sterling was building the skyline of New York, Mrs. Sterling was, otherwise engaged." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was the strategy. Accuse the wife of what the husband was doing. Classic projection. Odetta didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table. "We ask for a summary judgment, upholding the original prenup," Pendleton concluded, "and we ask that Mrs. Sterling be responsible for all legal fees incurred by this frivolous attempt at extortion." Pendleton sat down, looking pleased. Madame leaned over. "Brilliant, Arthur. You gutted her." "Mr. Cross?" Judge Thorne asked, looking at the disheveled man next to Odetta. "Your opening—" Samuel Cross stood up. He didn't stride to the center of the room. He stayed behind his table holding a single piece of paper. He looked nervous. "Your Honor," Cross mumbled. We simply ask for the truth. We believe the prenup is invalid, not because of infidelity on Mrs. Sterling's part, but because the assets declared 20 years ago were incomplete. And we believe the empire Mr. Pendleton speaks of was built on a foundation that Mrs. Sterling poured herself. He sat down abruptly. That was it. 30 seconds. No fireworks, no accusations. Julianne laughed out loud again, quickly covering her mouth, but the sound echoed. Even Judge Thorne looked unimpressed. "Is that all, Counselor?" Thorne asked. "For now, Your Honor," Cross said, looking down at his shoes. Madame looked at Julianne. "It's over. We'll be at lunch by noon." But as Madame looked across the aisle, he saw Odetta turn her head. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes weren't sad. They weren't angry. They were cold. Dead cold. And then the corner of her mouth lifted in the tiniest, almost imperceptible smile. It was the smile of someone watching a man walk onto a bridge she had already rigged to blow. The morning session dragged on, becoming a brutal exercise in humiliation for Odetta. Pendleton called witness after witness, a parade of Manhattan's elite, who had once eaten at Odetta's table and drunk her wine, now eager to stab her in the back to curry favor with Madam. First was Cynthia Reynolds, a socialite who had been Odetta's best friend for a decade. She took the stand in a Chanel suit, avoiding Odetta's eyes. "Ms. Reynolds," Pendleton asked, leaning on the witness stand, "did Odetta ever speak to you about her husband's money?" Cynthia sighed a theatrical exhale. "Oh, constantly. It was all she cared about. I remember in 2018, we were in Aspen. Odetta told me, 'I'm just waiting for the right time to cash out. Madame is just a bank account to me.'" The gallery gasped. Odetta's lawyer, Samuel Cross, didn't object. He just scribbled on a yellow legal pad. "Did she ever mention other men?" Pendleton pressed. Cynthia hesitated, glancing at Madame, who gave her an encouraging nod. "She did. She mentioned a tennis instructor. She said what Madame didn't know wouldn't hurt him." "Liar." The shout didn't come from Odetta. It came from the back of the room, from an old woman, Odetta's former housekeeper. The bailiff moved to silence her, but the damage was done. The room was buzzing. Pendleton smiled. No further questions. Cross stood up to cross-examine. He shuffled his way to the podium. Ms. Reynolds, Cross said, looking confused. You said you were in Aspen in 2018 with Mrs. Sterling. Yes, in December, Cynthia said confidently. That's strange, Cross said, pulling a piece of paper from his messy pile. Because I have hospital records here indicating Mrs. Sterling was in Mount Sinai Hospital in December 2018, undergoing surgery for ovarian cysts. She was bedridden for 3 weeks. He held up the paper. Cynthia froze. Her eyes darted around the room. Well, perhaps it was 2017, or January. I don't recall the exact dates. So you don't recall the date, but you recall the exact words she used about her husband being a bank account, Cross asked, his voice suddenly losing its nervous tremor. Yes, I remember the sentiment. The sentiment, Cross repeated. Thank you. No further questions. It was a small victory, a tiny crack in the dam, but Madame wasn't worried. One confused witness didn't change the facts. Then came the centerpiece of the defense. The defense calls Julianne Vane to the stand, Pendleton announced. A shockwave went through the room. It was highly unusual to call the Mistress, but Pendleton wanted to flaunt it. He wanted to show the contrast, the young, vibrant future versus the old, bitter past. Julianne stood up, smoothing her red dress. She walked to the stand like it was a runway chin high. She was sworn in. Ms. Vane, Pendleton began gently. You are currently in a relationship with Mr. Sterling, correct? I am, she said, her voice breathy and sweet. We are very much in love. And when did this relationship begin? After Mr. Sterling and his wife had already separated emotionally. Julianne lied smoothly. Madam was broken. He was lonely. He told me his marriage had been a sham for years. He was sleeping in the guest house. And have you interacted with Mrs. Sterling? Once, Julianne said, looking directly at Odetta with a sneer. She came to Madame's office. She was screaming, throwing things. She demanded $5 million cash to leave us alone. She called me terrible names. It was frightening. She seemed unstable. Odetta remained a statue. She wanted to sell her husband for $5 million, Pendleton asked, feigning shock. Yes. She said, pay me and you can have the old fool. Julianne giggled. Sorry, that's what she said. Madame covered a smile with his hand. This was perfect. They were painting Odetta as a gold-digging, abusive harpy. Your witness, Pendleton said. Samuel Cross stood up. He didn't walk to the podium this time. He stood right at the edge of his table. Ms. Vane, Cross said softly, you said you are very much in love with Mr. Sterling. I am. And you value honesty in a relationship. Of course. Interesting, Cross said. He picked up a document. You stated you met Mr. Sterling 6 months ago at a charity gala. That's right. Ms. Vane, are you aware that perjury is a felony? Cross asked, his tone darkening. Objection, Pendleton barked, badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Thorne said, though he leaned forward with interest. Get to the point, Mr. Cross. Ms. Vane, Cross continued, we have credit card receipts from Mr. Sterling's corporate account, paying for an apartment in Soho leased in your name starting 3 years ago, long before the emotional separation you spoke of. Julianne blinked. The color drained slightly from her face. I did some consulting work for the firm. That was housing for work. Consulting. Cross nodded. And the Porsche Cayenne purchased in your name in 2022. Was that for consulting? Yes, I needed to travel to sites. And the trip to the Maldives in 2021. A business trip. Julianne snapped, her composure cracking. Look, what does this matter? The marriage was dead. Everyone knew it. So you admit you were seeing him for years, not months. I admit he loved me, Julianne shouted, pointing at Odetta. He loved me because I made him feel alive. You made him feel like a wallet. You're just a bitter, dried-up old woman who can't stand that he upgraded. The courtroom erupted. Judge Thorne banged his gavel. Order Ms. Vane, watch your tone. Cross waited for the room to quiet down. He looked at Julianne, who was breathing heavily, her chest heaving in the tight red dress. No further questions, Cross said quietly. He had baited her. He had made her show her true colors, the entitlement, the rage. But still, proving the affair didn't invalidate the prenup. The prenup was ironclad, unless they could prove Madam lied about his money. The defense rests, Pendleton said, trying to regain control of the narrative. He glared at Julianne as she stepped down. She looked less triumphant now, her hands shaking as she grabbed her Birkin bag. We will break for lunch, Judge Thorne announced. Court reconvenes at 1:30 p.m. Be prompt. As the room cleared, Madame grabbed Julianne's arm. What was that? You were supposed to be the sympathetic victim. He tricked me, Julianne hissed. He had receipts, Madame. You told me that money was untraceable. It was through the shell company, Madame whispered angrily. How did he get those? Across the room. Odetta was packing her bag. Samuel Cross leaned in. We bloodied their nose, Cross said. But now comes the hard part. We have to prove the financial fraud. If we can't prove he hid the assets, the judge has to enforce the prenup. Odetta snapped the lock on her briefcase. Don't worry, Samuel. The assets aren't the only thing he hid. You have the file? Cross asked, his voice barely a whisper. Not yet, Odetta said, looking at the heavy oak door where the judge had exited. But Judge Thorne does. He just doesn't know what it means yet. She looked back at Madame, who was berating Julianne near the exit. Let him think he's winning for one more hour, Odetta said. It makes the fall so much more satisfying. The courtroom air was heavy with the scent of rain and stale coffee when the session resumed at 1:30 p.m. The gallery was still packed, the murmurs quieter now, tinged with a nervous energy. The morning's entertainment, Julianne's meltdown, had whetted their appetite for blood. Madam Sterling sat at the defense table, his composure regained. He had spent the lunch hour on the phone with his PR team, spinning the narrative. Crazy ex-wife harasses current fiancé, the headlines would read by evening. He felt secure. The law was math, and the math was on his side. The prenup, signed 20 years ago, capped Odetta's settlement at $2 million. For a man worth $4 billion, that was pocket change. Arthur Pendleton leaned back, checking his cufflinks. Your Honor, the defense is ready to move to closing arguments. The plaintiff has failed to produce any evidence invalidating the agreement. Samuel Cross stood up. He looked even more disheveled than before, his tie slightly askew. But his eyes behind the thick glasses were sharp, focused, like lasers. Not quite, Your Honor, Cross said, his voice steady. We would like to call Mr. Madam Sterling to the stand regarding the financial disclosures attached to the prenuptial agreement. Pendleton scoffed. Objection. Irrelevant. The agreement is standard. If the assets were fraudulently concealed at the time of signing, Judge Thorne said, peering over his glasses, the agreement is void, overruled. Mr. Sterling, take the stand. Madame buttoned his jacket and walked to the stand. He moved with the easy grace of a predator. He winked at Julianne as he passed the gallery. She forced a smile, but her eyes were anxious. Madame placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. He looked at Cross with a mix of boredom and pity. "Mr. Sterling," Cross began, holding a stack of documents. "In 2005, when you asked Odetta to sign the pre-NIP, you declared your total assets to be valued at $10 million. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Madame said smoothly. "I was just starting out. It was a humble beginning." "Humble," Cross repeated. "And you listed your primary assets as Sterling Development and a few residential properties in Queens." "Yes." "Did you list Sterling Horizon Limited?" Madame blinked. A microscopic twitch in his jaw muscle was the only sign of tension. I believe that was a defunct holding company. It had no value." "No value," Cross said. He picked up a sheet of paper. "I have here a bank statement from the Bank of Nevis, dated 2 days before the prenup was signed. It shows a balance in the account of Sterling Horizon Limited of $55 million. The gallery whispered. That must be a mistake," Madame said, his smile tightening. "Administrative error. I wasn't involved in the day-to-day accounting." $55 million is a large administrative error, Mr. Sterling," Cross noted dryly. "But let's move forward. 2010. You purchased the Plaza District Tower. You claimed in court documents during a separate lawsuit that you used personal savings. Yet in your tax returns you claimed a loss." "Creative accounting is not a crime, Mr. Cross," Madame said, regaining his footing. "It's smart business." "Is it?" Cross walked back to his table and picked up a heavy bound black book. "We subpoenaed the records of your offshore entities, specifically a trust in the Cook Islands named the Vane Trust." Julianne gasped audibly in the front row. All heads turned to her. "The Vane Trust," Madame said, his voice dropping an octave. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" Cross opened the book. "Because this trust was established 6 years ago. The sole beneficiary is listed as Julianne Vane. The assets in this trust include the deed to the penthouse you currently reside in, a yacht docked in Miami, and stock options valued at $100 million. Judge Thorne leaned forward, his eyebrows knitting together. "Mr. Sterling, you are under oath. Did you transfer marital assets into a trust for your mistress while currently married to the plaintiff?" "It was investment planning," Madame stammered, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "It wasn't marital assets. It was from my private equity dividends. Dividends earned during the marriage are marital assets. Mr. Sterling," Judge Thorne said, his voice like ice. "But the prenup," Madame shouted, losing his cool. "The prenup separates our finances. She gets nothing." "The prenup," Cross interrupted, his voice rising for the first time, "protects assets declared. You hid $100 million in a mistress's name to avoid splitting it with your wife. That is fraud, Mr. Sterling, and fraud pierces the corporate veil." Pendleton jumped up. "Objection, counsel is speculating. I have the wire transfers." Cross slammed a sheaf of papers onto the judge's bench. "Signed by Madame Sterling. Authorized by Madame Sterling. Deposited into an account controlled by Julianne Vane." The courtroom was in chaos. Reporters were furiously typing on their phones. Julianne was pale, clutching her bag as if she wanted to run. Madame glared at Odetta. She was still sitting there, saunt, watching him. That slight smile was gone, replaced by a look of profound disappointment. It infuriated him. He was the Titan of New York. She was a librarian's daughter. How dare she look at him like he was small? "This is irrelevant," Madam roared, pointing a finger at Cross. She signed the paper. She agreed to walk away. "This is a witch hunt." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling," Judge Thorne barked. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." Madam sat his chest, heaving. He looked at Pendleton, who was frantically flipping through his own files, looking for a way out. "Mr. Cross," Judge Thorne said, adjusting his glasses, "you have proven that the defendant has been less than transparent with his finances. However, the pre-enup has a specific clause regarding independent discovery. Unless you can prove that Mrs. Sterling had no knowledge of these accounts, the defense can argue she condoned them." "We can prove more than that, Your Honor," Cross said. He turned to Odetta. She nodded once. Cross reached into his battered briefcase. He didn't pull out a stack of papers this time. He pulled out a single thin manila file folder. It was old, the edges yellowed and curled. It wasn't a digital printout. It was an original document, preserved from a different era. "Your Honor," Cross said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the back of the silent room. "We are not asking you to void the prenup based on the money hidden in the Cook Islands. We are asking you to void it based on this." He walked up to the bench and placed the single file before Judge Thorne. The room went deathly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming. All eyes were glued to that yellow folder lying on the dark mahogany of the judge's bench. Judge Thorne looked at the folder. It was labeled simply, "Project Genesis, 1999. He looked up at Cross, then at Madame. Madame was frowning. He didn't recognize the file. 1999. He was just a hustler back then, flipping brownstones in Brooklyn. What could possibly be in there? Judge Thorne opened the file. He read the first page. He flipped to the second. He stopped. He took off his glasses. He cleaned them slowly with a microfiber cloth, his eyes never leaving the document. He put them back on and read the page again, as if ensuring his eyes weren't deceiving him. Then he looked up. The expression on his face had changed. The stern judicial annoyance was gone. In its place was a look of cold, hard fury. "Mr. Pendleton," Judge Thorne said quietly. "Yes, Your Honor," Pendleton asked, sensing a shift in the tectonic plates of the courtroom. "Are you aware of the contents of this file?" I have never seen it, Your Honor." "Mr. Sterling." The judge turned his gaze to the witness stand. It wasn't a question, it was a summons. "I don't know what that is," Madame said, though a cold knot of dread was forming in his stomach. Judge Thorne picked up the file. He held it up for the court to see. It was a single legal document, signed and notarized with a red wax seal at the bottom. "This, Judge Thorne," said his voice booming now, "is a deed of trust and incorporation for Sterling Development, dated March 1999. "So," Madam shrugged, trying to laugh it off. "That's when I founded the company." "No," Judge Thorne corrected him. "This is when the company was co-founded. According to this document, the initial seed capital of $500,000, the money that bought the first building, the money that started the entire empire, did not come from you, Mr. Sterling." The judge looked at Odetta. "It came from an inheritance left to Odetta Vance, your wife." The room gasped. "That's a lie," Madam shouted. "She loaned me that money. I paid it back." "It wasn't a loan," Judge Thorne read from the file. Clause 4, Section A. In exchange for the seed capital, Odetta Vance is hereby granted 50% equity in Sterling Development and all future subsidiaries in perpetuity. This equity cannot be diluted or transferred without her express written consent. Madame felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered now. The basement apartment, the desperation. He had needed the money to close the deal on the waterfront property. Odetta had her grandmother's inheritance. He had promised her the moon. He had signed the paper she wrote up on a typewriter. Because he thought it didn't matter, he thought he could talk her out of it later. He thought he had destroyed the only copy. I shredded that, Madame whispered. He didn't mean to say it aloud. The microphone picked it up. Excuse me, Judge Thorne asked, leaning in. I mean, that document is a forgery, Madame shouted, pivoting wildly. She typed it up yesterday. It is notarized, Judge Thorne said, his voice cutting through the panic. By a notary public in Kings County, dated March 12, 1999. And, the judge turned the page, there is an addendum, a silent partner clause. Odetta Vance agrees to remain a silent partner to aid Madame Sterling's public image, but retains full veto power over all major asset liquidation. Judge Thorne closed the file and set it down heavily. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, this document predates your marriage. It predates the prenup. It means that for the last 20 years you have not been the sole owner of Sterling Development. You have been a 50% partner, and every asset you sold, every dollar you moved, every dividend you took to buy yachts for your mistress. The judge paused, letting the weight of the words crush the air out of the room. Was theft. Odetta finally spoke. She didn't stand up. She just leaned into her microphone. I didn't want the money, Madame, she said, her voice clear and sad. I just wanted you to be the man I fell in love with, the man who needed my help. But when you tried to erase me, when you tried to say I was nothing but a leech, she shook her head. I kept the original, she said, in a safety deposit box you didn't know about. I was saving it for our children if we ever had them. But you were too busy building your empire to have a family. Madame looked at Pendleton. Fix this, Arthur, fix this. Arthur Pendleton was closing his briefcase. He stood up. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, and my client's admission that he shredded what he thought was the original, I must request a recess to review my position as counsel. You're firing me? Madame screamed. I pay you. You paid me to defend a divorce, Pendleton said coldly. You didn't pay me to be an accomplice to grand larceny and fraud. I'm out. Mr. Cross, Judge Thorne said, ignoring the screaming billionaire. What is the plaintiff's motion? Samuel Cross stood tall. He didn't look like a strip mall lawyer anymore. He looked like the executioner. Your Honor, Cross said, since the prenup was based on a fraudulent declaration of sole ownership, we move to void it. Furthermore, we move to enforce the 1999 partnership agreement. We ask for the immediate dissolution of the Sterling Trust and the freezing of all assets held by Madame Sterling and Julianne Vane, pending a forensic audit to return the 50% of capital stolen from my client over the last 2 decades. Granted. Judge Thorne slammed the gavel. Wait, Julianne shrieked. You can't freeze my accounts. That's my money. He gave it to me. If it was stolen money, Miss Vane, Judge Thorne said, looking at her with disdain. It was never yours, and considering you just admitted under oath that the relationship began years ago, you might want to look for a lawyer of your own. You're looking at conspiracy charges. Julianne turned on Madame. You said you were safe. You said she was stupid. She started hitting him with her Birkin bag, screaming in inchoate rage until the bailiffs had to pull her off. Madame sat in the witness chair alone. The flashing cameras outside were nothing compared to the spotlight burning him now. He looked at Odetta. She was gathering her papers. She stood up, picked up her old briefcase, and turned to walk away. Odetta, Madame croaked. Odetta, wait. We can talk. We can work this out. 50-50. We're partners, right? Odetta stopped. She looked back at the man who had been her world, the man who had walked in with a mistress and a smirk. No, Madame, she said. The partnership agreement has a dissolution clause, too, in the event of gross misconduct or criminal activity by one partner. The other partner assumes full control of the entity. She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I'm not taking half. I'm taking it all. The walk out of the courthouse was a mirror image of the morning's arrival, but distorted into a nightmare for Madame Sterling. At 9:00 a.m., the cameras had loved him. Now at 3:00 p.m., they were devouring him. Odetta exited first. She didn't stop to gloat. She didn't give interviews. She simply walked down the stairs, flanked by Samuel Cross, who looked like he had grown 6 inches taller. The paparazzi parted for her, not out of fear, but out of stunned respect. The silent partner had just spoken, and the roar was deafening. She slipped into a waiting taxi, a yellow cab, not a limousine, and vanished into the city traffic. Then Madame emerged. He was alone. His lawyer Pendleton had slipped out a side exit to avoid the taint of association. Julianne was nowhere to be seen. She was currently in a conference room with a court-appointed public defender, trying to explain why she shouldn't be charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. As Madame stepped onto the sidewalk, the questions hit him like physical blows. Mr. Sterling, is it true you stole your wife's inheritance? Madam, are you going to jail? How does it feel to lose the company, Madam? He pushed through them, his face a mask of rage. He reached for the door handle of his lead Escalade. It was locked. He pulled again. The driver's window rolled down an inch. It was his longtime chauffeur, Benny. Open the door, Benny, Madame snapped. Can't do that, Mr. Sterling. Benny said, his eyes averted. I just got a call from the fleet management company. The account is frozen. They ordered immediate repossession of the vehicles. I can't let you in. I pay your salary, Madame screamed, slamming his hand on the glass. Actually, the company pays my salary, Benny said, and the new acting CEO just sent a memo. Anyone aiding you is terminated immediately. Sorry, boss. The window rolled up. The engine purred, and the 3 SUVs, Madame's symbol of power, pulled away into traffic, leaving him standing on the curb in the drizzle. The paparazzi laughed. It was a cruel hyena-like sound. Madame needed to get away. He hailed a cab, but 3 drove past him. Finally, one stopped. He threw himself into the back seat. The Pierre Hotel, he barked, and drive fast. He needed to regroup. He needed cash. He needed a drink. He pulled out his phone to call his banker in the Cayman Islands, but the screen was dead. Service suspended. You have got to be kidding me, he whispered, staring at the black screen. Odetta hadn't just frozen his assets. She had nuked his entire infrastructure. He arrived at the Pierre. He marched to the front desk, soaking wet. I need the presidential suite. Put it on my black card. He slapped the American Express Centurion card on the marble counter. The concierge, a man who had bowed to Madame for 10 years, took the card. He swiped it. He frowned. He swiped it again. I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Sterling, the concierge said, his voice dripping with false polite concern. The card has been declined. Code 04. Pick up and destroy. The concierge took a pair of scissors from under the desk and snipped the black titanium card in half. "You can't do that." Madame lunged over the counter. Security guards were on him in a second, pinning his arms back. "Mr. Sterling, you are causing a scene," the manager said, stepping out. "We have also been informed that your standing reservation has been cancelled by the billing party Sterling Development. You'll have to leave." Thrown out on Fifth Avenue, Madame felt a vibration in his pocket. It wasn't his phone. It was Julianne's. He had been holding it for her when she went to the stand. It was a text message from a contact named Artie Hedge Fund. "Saw the news, babe. Brutal. If you need a place to crash and a new ride, I'm at the penthouse. Ditch the loser." Madame stared at the screen. Julianne hadn't just been with him for the money. She was already hedging her bets with his rivals. He threw the phone into a puddle. He had no car, no money, no home, no mistress. And as the rain began to pour harder, he realized the terrifying truth: he was just a man in a wetsuit. And in New York City, a man without money is a ghost. But ghosts can still haunt the living. He walked to a payphone, a relic he hadn't touched in 20 years, and used his last quarter. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago, a number for problems that lawyers couldn't fix. "It's me," Madame said into the receiver. "We have a problem. The one file got out. No, I don't care about the jail time. I care about her. She took it all, Victor. I want you to make sure she never gets to sit in my chair. Yes, tonight." The next morning, the Sterling Development headquarters in Midtown Manhattan was buzzing with a chaotic energy. Shredders were humming in the finance department. Executives were packing boxes, terrified they were next on the chopping block. At 10 a.m., the elevator doors to the executive floor opened. Odetta Sterling walked out. She wasn't wearing the grey suit from court. She wore a sharp, midnight blue dress that commanded attention. She walked past the reception desk where she used to be, made to wait for hours to see her own husband. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling," the receptionist stammered, standing up. "I mean, Miss Vance, Odetta is fine," she said calmly. "Please call security. I need the office of the CEO opened." "Mr. Sterling has the only key card," the receptionist said nervously. "Not anymore," a voice boomed. The head of building security, a burly man named O'Malley, walked up. He had never liked Madame, who treated the guards like furniture. He held up a master override key. "Right this way, ma'am." They walked to the double glass doors at the end of the hall. O'Malley swiped the card. The doors hissed open. The office was a shrine to Madame's ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk made of shark-skin portraits of himself on every wall. "Clear it out," Odetta said, standing in the center of the room. "Take the portraits down. Sell the furniture. I want a plain wooden desk, and I want the walls bare." "Yes, ma'am," O'Malley said. Samuel Cross entered behind her carrying a stack of files. "The forensic accountants are already downstairs. It's worse than we thought, Odetta. He was leveraging the company assets to fund gambling debts in Macau. If you hadn't stopped him, Sterling Development would have been bankrupt in 6 months." Odetta walked to the window and looked out at the city. "He didn't build an empire, Samuel. He built a house of cards, and he used my foundation to hold it up." "There's something else," Cross said, his voice dropping. "We found a recurring payment in the miscellaneous ledger. $10,000 a month cash to a consultant named Victor Malakoff." "Do you know that name?" Odetta froze. The name sounded familiar, a shadow from the past. "Victor Malakoff," she whispered. "Madame used to know a guy in the 90s, a fixer for the construction unions. He was dangerous, Samuel. Madame swore he cut ties with him." "Apparently not," Cross said grimly. "The payments stopped yesterday, when you froze the accounts." A cold chill ran down Odetta's spine. A man like Malakoff didn't take kindly to his checks bouncing, and a man like Madame, with his back against the wall, would be looking for a weapon. "You need security," Cross said. "Real security. Not just the building guys." "I'll be fine," Odetta said, though she didn't feel it. "I'm going home to the estate tonight to pack the rest of his things. I want him completely erased from my life by tomorrow." "Don't go alone," Cross warned. "I have to," Odetta said. "It's the house my grandmother's money bought. I need to reclaim it myself." That evening, Odetta drove her Honda Civic up the winding driveway of the Sterling estate in the Hamptons. The house was dark. The staff had been given the week off during the trial. It stood like a Gothic castle against the stormy sky. She unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. It was silent. She walked to the library, where Madame kept his personal safe. She needed to ensure he hadn't left any more surprises. She opened the heavy oak door and flipped the light switch. The light didn't turn on. "The bulb must be out," she muttered, reaching for her phone flashlight. "The bulb is fine," a voice spoke from the darkness. "I cut the breaker." Odetta gasped and dropped her keys. A lighter flicked on, illuminating a face sitting in the high-backed leather chair. It was Madame. He looked unhinged. His expensive suit was rumpled and stained. His tie was gone. He was holding a glass of scotch in one hand and a heavy iron fireplace poker in the other. "Madame," Odetta said, her voice trembling but loud. "Get out! You are trespassing!" "Trespassing?" Madame laughed, a dry, cracking sound. "In my own house, with my own wife." "I am not your wife anymore," Odetta said, stepping back toward the door. "And this isn't your house. The deed was in the trust I control." Madame stood up, swaying slightly. "You think you won, don't you? You think a piece of paper makes you the boss?" "You're nothing, Odetta. You were a shy little girl when I found you. I made you a sterling." "I made you," Odetta shouted back, finding her courage. "I gave you the money. I gave you the connections. I gave you 20 years of loyalty, while you slept with half of New York. And this is how you repay me," Madame roared, swinging the poker and smashing a vase on the mantel. "By taking my life, by humiliating me." He took a step toward her. The firelight from the lighter cast long, demonic shadows on his face. "I have nothing left, Odetta," he hissed. "And if I have nothing, you get nothing." From the shadows behind the door, another figure stepped out. A large man in a dark trench coat. Viktor Malakoff. "Is this her?" Malakoff asked, his voice like gravel. "That's her," Madame said. "The woman who cut off your checks." Odetta backed into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. She turned to run, but Malakoff was faster. He blocked the exit. "Sign the papers, Odetta," Madame said, pulling a crumpled document from his pocket. "Transfer the voting rights back to me. Sign it and Victor leaves. Don't sign it. And we have a tragedy, a burglary gone wrong." So sad. Odetta looked at the poker. She looked at Malakoff. She looked at Madame, the man she had once promised to love forever. She realized then that there was no negotiating. He didn't just want the company back. He wanted her destroyed. "I don't have a pen," Odetta said softly. Madame smiled, his teeth flashing in the dark. "I have one right here." He reached into his pocket. As he looked down, Odetta grabbed the heavy brass statue of justice that sat on the hallway table, the scales in one hand, the sword in the other. She didn't wait for the pen. She swung the statue with every ounce of rage she had suppressed for 20 years. The heavy brass statue of Lady Justice connected with Madame's shoulder with a sickening crunch. He howled in pain, dropping the fireplace poker and stumbling back against the wall, clutching his arm. The expensive Italian wool of his suit tore, revealing the bruising skin beneath. "Get her!" Madame screamed, his face contorted in agony. "Don't just stand there, Victor!" Victor Malakoff lunged. He was a massive man, used to intimidating union reps and frightening debtors. But he had miscalculated. He was expecting a terrified socialite, a woman who would cower and beg. He wasn't expecting a woman fighting for her very existence. Odetta didn't run away. She ran forward. She used the momentum of her swing to dive past Malakoff, sliding across the polished hardwood floor in her heels. She scrambled to her feet, kicked off her shoes, and sprinted toward the kitchen. "You can't hide in here." Malakoff shouted, his heavy footsteps thundering down the hallway behind her like a freight train. Odetta burst into the kitchen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't go for the butcher block of knives. That was a fight she would lose. She went for the smart home panel mounted by the refrigerator. Her fingers flew across the screen, entering a code only she knew. Security, panic mode. Instantly, the house exploded with noise. A deafening, high-pitched siren wailed, shaking the windows. Outside the exterior, floodlights began to strobe, turning the dark, stormy estate into a blinding lighthouse beacon visible for miles. Malakoff skidded into the kitchen, shielding his eyes from the sudden, disorienting, flashing lights. "Turn it off," he bellowed, pulling a handgun from his coat. Odetta stood her ground by the panel. "The police are already on their way," she shouted over the siren. "This system is linked directly to the Hamptons precinct. Priority 1 alarm. You have 3 minutes. Victor! Do you want to go down for attempted murder for a man who can't even pay you?" Malakoff froze. The gun wavered. He looked at Maum, who limped into the room, face pale, sweating, and clutching his shattered shoulder. "She's lying!" Madame yelled, his voice desperate. "Finish her. We can make it look like a break-in. Shoot her." Malakoff looked at Madame, a broken man in a ruined suit. Then he looked at the strobe lights pulsing outside. He heard the faint rising wail of swans in the distance, real ones getting closer by the second. "You said this would be clean," Malakoff growled at Madame, holstering his weapon. "You said she was weak." "She is," Madame insisted, eyes wide with panic. "Do it," Malakoff sneered, backing toward the patio doors. "She's smarter than you, and I don't work for charity." Without another word, Malakoff turned, shattered the glass of the back door with his elbow, and vanished into the rainy night. He wasn't going to prison for a broke billionaire. Madame was alone. Again. He looked at Odetta. The siren was still blaring a chaotic, pulsing soundtrack to their final moment. He slumped against the granite island, the fight draining out of him. He slid down to the floor, looking suddenly very old. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why didn't you just sign the divorce papers? We could have both been rich. I would have given you 5 million, maybe 10. Odetta walked over to the island, keeping a safe distance. She looked down at him, not with hate, but with a profound, cold pity. "Because you didn't just want to leave me, Madame," she said, her voice steady. "You wanted to erase me. You wanted to pretend that I never existed, that my contribution meant nothing. You fell in love with your own reflection, and you broke the mirror, because it finally showed you the truth." Blue and red lights flashed against the kitchen windows, mixing with the strobes. Tires screeched on the gravel driveway. Police officers were pounding on the front door, shouting for entry. "It's over, madame," Odetta said. She walked to the front door and opened it. A squad of officers rushed in, guns drawn, rain dripping from their uniforms. "He's in the kitchen," Odetta said calmly, pointing down the hall. "He broke in. He assaulted me, and he violated a restraining order." As the officers hauled Madame Sterling out in handcuffs, marching him out of the house he had built with stolen money, he didn't look back at the mansion. He looked at Odetta. She stood on the porch, wrapped in her coat, watching him go. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just watched, a silent witness to his destruction. 6 months later. The rebrand was subtle but powerful. The gold letters of Sterling Development were scraped off the glass doors of the Midtown Tower. In their place, etched in simple, elegant frost, stood Vance and Partners. Odetta sat in the corner office. The shark skin desk was gone, replaced by a warm mahogany table covered in blueprints for a new sustainable housing project. Samuel Cross, now the chief legal officer, and looking significantly better dressed in a custom suit, walked in. "The verdict came in," Samuel said, placing a thick file on her desk. Odetta didn't look up from her blueprints immediately. She took a breath. "And guilty on all counts," Samuel said, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Fraud, embezzlement, assault. The judge gave Madame 15 years, no parole for at least 10. Odetta nodded slowly. "And Julianne?" "She took a plea deal," Samuel replied. "She gave up the access codes to the Cayman accounts. She got probation and 500 hours of community service. Last I heard, she's picking up trash on the Jersey Turnpike." Odetta finally smiled. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The New York skyline glittered before her, a sea of lights and steel. It was a city of sharks, yes. But sometimes, even in a tank full of sharks, the quietest swimmer is the one who rules the water. "And the restitution?" she asked. "Every penny," Samuel confirmed. "The hidden accounts have been liquidated. The money is back in the company. We have enough to fund the Bronx Initiative twice over." Odetta pressed her hand against the cool glass. She had her name back. She had her life back. And most importantly, she had proven that while a billionaire can buy a mistress, a lawyer, and a judge, he cannot buy the truth. "Good," Odetta said, turning back to her work. "Let's get back to business, Samuel. We have an empire to rebuild the right way this time." And that is how Odetta Sterling turned a humiliating divorce into a masterclass in justice. She proved that dignity is stronger than arrogance, and that the truth, no matter how deep it's buried, always finds a way to the surface. Madame thought he was untouchable because of his bank account. But he forgot the most important rule of business. Never underestimate the silent partner. If you enjoyed this story of revenge, betrayal, and ultimate redemption, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells us you want more stories like this. What would you have done if you were Odetta? Would you have taken the settlement money, or would you have fought for everything? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, so you never miss a story. We have plenty more tales of karma coming your way. Thanks for watching.